Okay, what we're going to talk about today are tables in HTML. And what do I mean by table? By table, I mean a table of data like you would have in an Excel worksheet. All right, where you have rows and columns of data. And let's see if we can find a table, good example of a table on the web. Sort of cement exactly what I mean. Okay, here's an example of it. You could have something like this in an Excel worksheet, all right? You have rows. There's a header row at the very top. There is a row for each city. And within that row, there are columns. There are cells, if you will. For the high temperature in Fahrenheit, the low temperature in Fahrenheit, the name of the city, the high temperature centigrade, the low temperature in centigrade. You could even, although this example doesn't have it, have something at the bottom that showed sort of an average of all those. At any rate, that's what I mean by a table. It is rows and columns. So let's try to recreate this table in HTML. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to move this off to the side so I can see, so I can copy the data in the table. And I'm going to do something like this. High Fahrenheit, put some spaces in it, low Fahrenheit, put some spaces, city, spaces, high centigrade, spaces. Now, if you're thinking about this closely, this isn't going to work. But let's see exactly why it's not going to work. So I could go in and I'll just put a couple rows in. $73, $54, Atlanta, 23, 12. 81, 59, Austin, 27, 15. Now, we're going to see how this displays because it's not going to be what we wished it to be. You know, we'd wished it to look something like this, where we have rows and columns. However, if we save this and view it within the browser, it looks like that. All right. A little bigger so you can see. Why does it look like that? Well, because HTML takes all the white space on page and it displays it as a single space. So it doesn't take this return and put a new line. It doesn't take and add this many spaces between high and low or between low and city and so on. It just takes all this and compresses it, and everywhere there's a white space, it replaces it by a single space. So we get this one long line of data. All right. Even if this did work, it wouldn't be a good thing because it's a very valuable thing that HTML treats the white space the way it does. That way we can enter in our HTML code, whatever way makes it more readable, and have the browser display it the way we want. Plus, if we did it this way, it would be very fussy. A small change is liable to throw everything off. So what do we have instead? What we have is we have a table. And I'm going to replace this. I'm going to keep it there for now, just for reference, so I have the data in front of me. We have a table of data. A table of data means that we have rows and columns. All right? So a table consists of several rows. Rows are indicated in TR tags. So we have our table tag. It's going to contain all this. There's going to be a row, second row, a third row, as many rows as we need. And each of those rows will have as many columns as we need. So TR is how we indicate a table row. So we're doing the code for this one at first. Now, how do we indicate a column or a cell in the table row? We do it with either a TH or a TD. A TH stands for table header. So that's what this is. This isn't high, low, city. It's not the name of a city and the high and low temperatures. It's a heading. This says what the column means. So that's a heading, so we're going to make it TH. And we'll do that for the rest of the cells in this column. Visual Studio Code is nice enough to insert the end tag as soon as I type in the start tag. That really is very convenient for us. Okay, so there's our first row. Now we're going to put in our second row. Again, it's a row, so it's a TR. This is not headings, this is actual data. So we're going to use a TD tag. Finally, we're going to put one more TR in here. It's critical with tables to do the indenting correctly. Because if you didn't indent this correctly, it would be very difficult to see where the table starts and ends, where the TR starts and ends, where the TD starts and ends. And again, that's a nice thing that Visual Studio Code does for you. If you get a chance, try it out if you have not already. Okay, I've entered in the data into my tables. 3 rows, so there's 3 TRs. Each row contains 5 columns. It's not 100%, but usually there's going to be the same number of columns in each row. That's what makes for a table. It's possible to merge cells just like you do in Excel, but that's sort of the exception. All right, I'm going to get rid of this because we don't need it anymore because it didn't work anyhow. Now if we go and save it, we get a nice little column of data. Rows and columns. First column, second column, third column, fourth column, first row, second row, third row, and things line up underneath their tables, underneath their headers. How big does it make the table? It makes each column as big as it needs to be. What do I mean by as big as it needs to be? It makes it as big as the largest entry in that column. So right now, Atlanta is the biggest entry in this column. So it makes it the city column that wide. If we added on to it, and added the states to the end of the city name, it now makes that column wider. So it makes the columns as wide as they need to be. And so it makes the table as wide as it needs to be to fit all the columns. In this case, high, the heading, is the biggest thing in this column, so it makes it that wide. Low is the biggest thing in this column, so it makes it that wide. Same thing with high and low over here. If we were to type in, I don't know why we would do that, but if we were to type in 73 degrees Fahrenheit in this column, then it would make that column each bit that big. Now you might notice that first row is in bold and centered. And each subsequent row is left aligned and not bold. Why is that? Well, because that's the default behavior for TDs and THs. THs centers the text over the column. TDs left aligns it. So in this case, that's aligned to the left. The word high is centered over the column. Now, it might be a little hard to tell when this is the biggest thing, but that is centered within the width of the column because the column is as wide as high F, the letters for high F. It's easier to see in city. City is centered over this column. What if we do not want the top row to be bold and centered? Do we make it a TD? And the answer is no. An HTML tag should always describe what the content is, not how we want it to look. So if we want these not to be centered and not to be bold, we don't make them TDs. They're still table headings. We would just use CSS to change the way that the table is going to look by putting in styles for TDs, THs, and tables. You can add col span, COL span, and row span if you want to combine something over 2 rows or 2 columns. But again, generally speaking, that is fairly rare, and that could be confusing in a table. So I would suggest not to use that except under some strange circumstances. Now, in the old days, if you've been doing HTML for a while, you might, and this is a long while at this point in time, You may remember when tables were used to lay out a page. You would create a big table that covered the whole page. And you'd put in one row maybe the logo of the company and the navigation. And then in another row, you would put the advertisements. And maybe in another column, you would put the data for the page. If you know how to do that, don't do that anymore. Use CSS to design the layout of the page. Don't use tables to do that. If none of that made any sense to you, if you haven't done web development for a long time and you never use tables for the layouts of HTML pages, then forget that I said something and just never do it. All right. Now that's pretty simple, right? Well, the devil's in the details, as they say. And we can actually style a table. We can actually do a couple of things to make the table look better and to make the table more accessible. So we're going to look at the second example, which is a little more involved. This would be, for example, if we wanted to do a budget. And I didn't fill in the entire table, I just filled in a few months and just put some dummy data in the rest of them because I got lazy and I didn't want to type in the same thing over and over again. Let's say we were doing a website on personal finance and we wanted to show someone how to create a simple budget. We could do that by creating a table with rows and columns, because usually with a budget, you have the period of time, whether it be weeks or days or months or whatever, and then each column is different ways that you can spend, different money that you allocate to a particular expense. So if we look at the HTML code for this, it looks like what we had in the other example, there's just more of it. I put it inside an article. So like on the website, if you had an article about personal finance, you know, maybe you'd include the table. A couple of things I added instead of in addition to the 3 tags we've seen so far. So far, we've seen the table, 4 tags, table, TR, TH, and TD. First thing I added was a caption. And a caption is used both for appearance and for people that are accessing this via a screen reader. If we saw all these numbers on a page without some sort of introduction to it, like what does this mean, it might not be clear exactly what that data represents. So therefore, we put a caption on the table to describe what the table means. In this case, our caption is sample monthly budget. So this is beneficial for people that are using assistive technology, such as screen readers, but it's also useful for people that are not, because it gives a good introduction as to what the table means. Likewise, we put all the header rows within a T-head tag. Now that doesn't have any visible effect yet. All right. However, it's helpful for people with screen readers, and we can use the T-head tag when we're styling the page. Likewise, we have a T-body for the table that goes all over the rows of data. And that's an error. That should not be T-head. That should be T-body. Finally, we have a T-foot for when there's a footer. This is for things like tables. The other thing we have is we have a scope. And this is definitely doesn't have a visual effect, but it's useful for people with assistive technology. So for example, electric bill is the name of this column. So we put a scope on that to say electric bill is what this column means. It's the heading for this column. So if someone is having a screen reader read this and we see 523 and we don't know what that means, they can access and say, well, that's the gas bill. Likewise, we have a scope for row that says this data belongs to January. A lot of you, when you do these assignments, a lot of the people in the class in the past semesters forgot the scope attribute. That will be a deduction because it's important to identify for people that are accessing this via a screen reader what the columns mean and what is represented. What does the table represent? It represents a column, or in this case, it represents a row. This is the row for January. Now, when I did this example, I forgot the CSS code. I didn't save the CSS code. So we don't have a CSS file, but we're going to make one right now. So I'm going to put in here link rel equals style sheet type equals x/css href equals style.css. Save that. And I'll create a new file for a style sheet. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to give the body a color. Just to make sure that I've properly linked the style sheet with the HTML page. So I go and enter that in, and I'm going to save it as style.css. I'm going to put it in the same folder by HTML, and boom. Okay, so I know I have the link working. That's important to do, because if I didn't have this link correct, I typoed and spelled style wrong, and it wasn't working. If I've done a lot of work on that style sheet and it wasn't working, I'm going to be very confused. When the problem, it might not be in the style sheet, it might be in the way that you're linking it. So I always test to make sure I've linked it properly. As many web pages as I've developed, I always go and look and say, make sure that the web page and the CSS page are talking to each other. Now that I do that, I can even get rid of background color. Now we can style each of the elements separately. So we can put a style on TDs, THs, TRs. table as a whole, and so on. First thing we're going to do is I'm going to put a style on the article. I'm going to make the width 75%. And that should center that within the page. Remember to save everything. At this point, it isn't centered anymore because there's not enough to fill out the entire 75% width. All right, I can then give I could then give the table a width. And I'll center the table within the article. So here we go. Let me put some colors on this so that we understand how this works. Let me make the article yellow, make the table let's make this dark gray, and we'll make it a light gray. So we'll make this a dark gray. And we'll make this a light gray. So you notice that the article is as wide as the dark gray is, the table is as big as the light gray is. And as we resize it, it makes it smaller. If it can't fit everything in, notice it cuts off the word electric bill and puts that on two separate lines. Reach a certain point where it can't make it any smaller and fit everything in, then it cuts it off. It's not going to make the table smaller than it is, smaller than it needs to be. Let's put it that way. Okay. One other thing to notice, the width of this is 75% of the page. The width of this is 50%. It is 50% of that 75%. So it's not 50% of the entire page. It's 50% of its available space. And if its available space is the space of the article, which is 75%. So whenever you have nested tags like this and you do percentage, It's not of the entire page, but it is of the available space. So in this case, the article is 75% of the whole page. The width is 50% of that 75%. No matter what, though, it's not going to cut things off. Notice how it makes columns big or small, depending on how big the data is. This food column is very narrow because it doesn't take up much space, either the header or the data, whereas the month column is the widest. The browser automatically sizes those things for you. We can, however, control the size of it somewhat. Let's make this wider. Let's make this 100%. Again, that's not 100% of the whole page. That's 100% of the article. It tries to make them all even though some are bigger and smaller than others. And it makes them, it gives, how do I want to say this? It sizes them in proportion to the biggest piece of content. If I want them to be equal widths, I can do this. TH. Could do this either with a TH or a TR, or TD rather. I could give a width of each of these of 20%. So since there's 5 of them, the whole width will be 100%. So now each of these take up the even amount of the page. Now, one thing I think that is tough to read in this is the fact that the TDs by default are left aligned and the THs are center aligned. I can fix that by making the TDs center aligned. How do I do that? TD text align center. Now they line up underneath the headers, and it looks a little easier to read. Sometimes it's useful to put borders around certain things. So I could put a border around the whole table. So I could say border 5 pixels. Black, solid. Put a 5-pixel border around it. I could put borders around the rows if I wanted. Maybe I can't put a border around the TER. Let me put it around the TD. We have a border around that then. Notice that doesn't cover these because those are not TDs, those are THs. So I could put that same border around the THs if I wanted to. I'm making these borders wide just so that they're more visible. Now, notice that there's a little gap between the THs and the TDs and the TRs and all that. You can collapse that by saying on the table tag, border collapse, collapse. And that brings it, and that's probably more readable. So I almost always do border collapse on it, so I make the borders easier to read. Now, remember I said that we have, we have THs, and we have the T head, the T body, and the T foot. I can style those things. So I could say T head and maybe give it a different background color to make the header stand out. That's how the color of the T headers are somewhat different. It's just a bit darker. Let me make that a little more dramatic so that you can see it. Of course, now month is hard to read, so I probably would make the text color different. I could do the same thing with T foot and make it a different color because it is different than the rest of the table. We give things different color when they represent something different. So a footer column and a header column, or a footer row and a header row, are different than just rows of plain data. Now we have a table with just a little bit of styling that looks more readable. We do this again for readability, all right? And we do this to communicate. That's why we put styling on there, period. One of the reasons, of course, is to make our pages look more attractive and more visual appealing. But another reason is to help convey our meaning. So at a glance, the user can tell what the header and what the footer columns are. All right. Now, one thing that is especially true, and it's especially true if you have very wide columns with lots of, very wide rows rather, with lots of columns in them, is sometimes it's useful to alternate the colors. And I always forget how to do this, so I'm going to Google it. It's okay if you Google things. Shouldn't Google everything, but it's okay to Google some things if you don't remember them. So CSS alternating row color. So I just want to do this in the body section. So I can say T body. Odd rows within the body. I'm going to make the background color and that doesn't work. I have to say to the TRs in the T body section. I think that was my mistake. This might be a caching issue. Sometimes if you change a web page, it doesn't realize it's changed and it doesn't refresh it. I'm going to go and change the HTML page as well. Yeah. PR : nth child. Get rid of all of this other CSS. Maybe the CSS is interfering with each other. Yeah. Something in my CSS is interfering with that. But anyhow, that's how you do it. Curious still that that doesn't work. Anyhow, that's how you do it with the nth child bit. The other thing we can do, of course, is with classes. Let's say during February, because the weather's so cold, and we expect the temperature to be a lot a lot colder, and we're going to use more electricity. I don't know, maybe we use space heaters in our house or something. We can give a class to that, and I can assign a different characteristic based on the class. So I can say in my CSS, class name, And those things I designated as being a high bill stand out. Now, to someone that's colorblind, they may not be able to see that difference. We could run this through a colorblind filter and see what someone that's colorblind would view. So what I would do is I would also change and make maybe italic. That way, someone that can see color gets the visual cue that the numbers are italics and the background color is yellow. Whereas someone that can't see the color at least sees that the style is italics for those numbers, indicating that there's something special about them. All right, that in a nutshell is tables. I mean, like I said, there's a call span that allows you to split things, and a row span that allows you to have things cover multiple columns, multiple rows. I would advise against using that. I would also advise against using nested tables, which are very messy, and I wouldn't even want to go over an example to encourage you to even try those. So also avoid using nested tables as well. Those are an accessibility nightmare. All right, that's all I had for this week. We'll see you next week. The remainder of the semester is going to be focused on learning a bit of JavaScript, and we'll be finishing up your project. All right, we'll see you next week.